The Bible is not a series of disconnected stories. It is a single narrative in which every story, every character points beyond itself to one who is greater. The story of Adam and Eve is not just about the first man and woman. There is a true and better Adam who passed the test in the garden and whose obedience is ascribed to us. There is a true and better Abel who, though innocently slain, has blood that cries out not for our condemnation, but for our acquittal. There is a true and better Abraham who answered the call of God to leave all the comfortable and familiar and go out into the void to create a new people of God. There is a true and better Isaac, the son of laughter, of grace, who was not just offered up by his father on the mount, but was truly sacrificed for us all. There is a true and better Jacob, who wrestled and took the blow of justice we deserve, so we, like Jacob, only receive the wounds of grace that wake us up and discipline us. There is a true and better Joseph, who at the right hand of the king forgives those who betrayed and sold him and uses his new power to save them. There is a true and better Moses who stands in the gap between the people and the Lord and who mediates a new covenant. There is a true and better rock of Moses who, struck with the rod of God's justice, now gives us water in the desert. There is a true and better Job, the truly innocent sufferer, who then intercedes for and saves his foolish friends. There is a true and better David, whose victory becomes his people's victory, though they never lifted a stone to accomplish it themselves. There is a true and better Esther, who didn't just risk losing an earthly palace, but lost the ultimate heavenly one, who didn't just risk his life, but gave his life to save his people. There is a true and better Jonah, who was cast out into the storm so that we could be brought in. There is a true and better Passover lamb, innocent, perfect, helpless, slain so the angel of death will pass over us. He's the true temple, the true prophet, the true priest, the true king, the true sacrifice, the true lamb, the true light, and the true bread. The Bible is not a series of disconnected stories. It is a single narrative that points to one person, Jesus.
The reason I showed you that video was because I'm going to try something. As I prayed and debated and thought, what do we do here at Capital View? Where do we need to go? What do we need? I was thinking, at least we can try it. What if we go through the Bible together? We kind of already started. So last week, how many of you here last week? Here when I spoke last. Okay, so what did I talk about? What? Lost coin, sheep, and son. Right. It was out in the parking lot. Real test of memory. What did I talk about before that? He doesn't know. My life is meaningless. The great controversy. And so if we're going to go through the Bible, the great controversy is the place to start. And so I thought, well, let's try this. Let's just go through the Bible together and see what happens. Now, we're not going to hit everything, but we're going to try and hit, like the video says, the stories in the Bible are not single individual stories. They're all part of this one narrative. It's all part of the great controversy, the war between Christ and Satan, good and evil. In fact, if you read the Bible cover to cover, you'll find that each one of the stories is always pointing forward in some way to the Messiah, to Jesus. And they're also showing something about ourselves, something about each one. So that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and go through the big stories of the Bible and see how they relate to us. We have a lot to do today? Bert, you're in charge. If I go over 40 minutes, throw something at me. All right, here we go. Ready? Begin. Now, the first verse, so there are two major players in the Bible, all right? Outside of the war between Christ and Satan, there's two major players. Now, Jesus is the most important person in the New Testament. Who's the most important person in the Old Testament? Jesus. He wasn't a person yet. I knew someone would come up with that, and I knew it would be you. So, excluding Jesus, because he wasn't a person yet, he wasn't someone yet. Who's the most important person in the Old Testament? Abraham! Thank you very much. Oh, it's up there. Weird. Alright, Abraham. Alright, why is Abraham the most important person in the Old Testament? Number one, he's the founder of the nation of Israel. So you probably knew that. Israel, and even the Judaism today, counts Abraham as the founding father. That's where they all come from. They are sons and daughters of Abraham. He's mentioned by name 300 times in the Old and New Testament. Anytime the Bible gives you real estate, what's the topic? My other arm. Okay. Anytime. Alright, we're going to turn it off. Anytime the Bible gives you real estate, it's meaningful. Because there are so few words God could put in this book, he had to make every one of them count. So if you get 308 mentions in the Bible, that's important for a reason. Alright, also, he's the preeminent man of faith in the Bible. When the Bible talks about faith, many, many times, this is the guy they go to. You want to have faith, faith like Abraham. Abraham was the man of faith. Also, he is a man whose life changed the course of world history. You probably keep up, maybe some of you, with the events in the Middle East. It's really interesting to note that you can trace just about every one of those conflicts back to Abraham. And what happened with Ishmael, right? His choices and his life is still impacting the world today. The first verse of the chapter of Matthew's Gospel. So Matthew, the very first book of the Bible, Matthew, for the very first chapter, the very first verse, he wants to impress upon his readers the significance and the importance of Jesus as the Messiah. And he says, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, a son of David, a son of Abraham. He mentions the two biggest players in Judaism's history. This is how important Jesus is. He's the son of David and the son of Abraham. So, Abraham was huge in the Bible, huge in the life of the Israelites. However, as a teacher, and I have been a teacher for many years, if I was to take Abraham's life and I was to give it a grade, I'm afraid I would have to give Abraham an F. As a matter of fact, I give him 3 Fs. And today, I'm going to give you the reasons why I give Abraham 3 Fs and the 7 things we can learn from those things. 3 Fs and what we can learn from them. And we're going to go fast. All right, here we go. So, if this stops working, you guys can just get technology is not our friend today. All right, so okay, you know what? I'll just tell you when to hit it. Go. He gets an F. He gets 3 Fs. Keep going. And the first F, keep going, is faith. Abraham is a man of faith. So what happens? First of all, you've got, come down here. Terah, this is Abraham's father. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughters-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from the Ur of Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, that would be a cue as we go to the next one. Obviously it wasn't in there. Anyway, they stopped and they pitched their tents. Abraham did not grow up Adventist. Abraham didn't go to academy. Abraham didn't have prayer roll. Abraham didn't have Graceland to learn from and watch little videos that they make. Abraham grew up in a superstitious household. So here they pitched their tents in Mesopotamia. Even his father's household, by whom the knowledge of God had been preserved, were yielding to the seductive influences surrounding them, and they served other gods. Several other gods. Mesopotamia had lots of gods, and one of them was the sun god. That was fast. And, the moon god. And what they would do is they would have these little idols. They would have them in their homes. And they would say prayers to them in the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening. And Abraham was surrounded by this culture. Even this family that God had chosen to be his protectors of truth, they were beginning to give into the worship practice of those around them. Isn't it interesting, and throughout human history, that we always worship something, even if we're not, Christian in that day, even if we're not believers in God, men find something to worship. People will always have a God. If you want to know what your God is, answer two questions. One, what do you spend the most time with? Two, what are you willing to sacrifice for? There's your God. We will always find something to worship. And this is what was happening to Abraham. So he didn't have the greatest upbringing. He didn't have the greatest background to come from. So, even though he didn't have the greatest background, God still chose him to be his man. I mean, the man to start his nation, to preserve his knowledge and truth. So one of the first things we can learn from Abraham, your background is not a barrier to God's using you. Doesn't matter where you come from. Doesn't matter what your background is. Your background is not a barrier. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get serious here. All right, so if you guys can keep up with me on the slides, fine. This is what happens when you go low technology. Now, Leonardo da Vinci, right? You ever seen any one of his paintings? You know where he came from? He was the illegitimate son of a prostitute. That was his background. His father got together with a slave girl who was probably a prostitute, and this is where he comes from. What's his name? The guy that, he's all relative. Relativity. Yeah, thank you. Einstein. Didn't speak till he was 4 years old. Everyone growing up was telling him, this kid is dumb. This kid is slow. This kid's not amount to anything. Now, you've probably heard that. Have you really taken in what you've probably heard many years of his life? Light bulb.
Edison.
Thank you, Edison. The light bulb Edison was probably, what they think, was afflicted with severe ADHD, which made him a great pastor, by the way. But severe ADHD. Imagine growing up in a day where they didn't even know what that was. Your background is no barrier for how God can use you. It's one of the things we learned from Abraham. Okay, so Abraham gets called, Abraham gets called, and God comes down and he says, Abraham. Since I don't have my slides, I'll be paraphrasing the Bible today. This will be Revised Standard, Pastor Brett. Is it? Good. Follow along. The Lord said, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And there was a period. Okay. And that's all he said. Isn't God like that? He just never really gives us a whole lot of information. He did the same thing to the disciples. Yeah, the disciples are in the boat. And he said, leave your name. Come, follow me. What did he do to Matthew? Come, follow me. He did like, here's my 3-year plan to save the world. He doesn't give us a lot of information sometimes. He says, get up and go. I'll show you where you need to go next, but right now just get up and go. And this is what he told Abraham. Get up and go to the place I'm going to show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you will curse, and all people on the earth will be blessed through you. By the way, this is what we call a messianic prophecy. All the world will be blessed through you. All the nations will be blessed through you because one of your descendants is going to be the Messiah.
So here's another way the story is not just an isolated story, it's pointing forward to the coming Messiah. And God's telling him this. Now, what's really cool is Abraham didn't get it. A lot of times God tells us things and we have no idea the immenseness of what he's telling us because of our perspective. Get up and go. I'm going to do awesome things with you and through you. And I just can only imagine if I went with my wife and God told us to leave, sweetie. I don't know where we're going. Let's just start. Get up and they go. This is a huge act of faith. Okay? It's not the only time God's going to talk to them, but it's a huge act of faith. So off they go. All right. So, one, your background's not a barrier. Number two, don't let fear fence you in. There was a lot of reasons Abraham could have come up with for not going. A lot of reasons Sarah could have come up with for not going. A lot of reasons all of his employees could have come up with for not going. A lot of things that made sense to not go. But they didn't let fear stop them from taking the next step. Anybody? I haven't been to the zoo here. It's a zoo, right? Is it a cool zoo? Do they have elephants? Omaha has elephants. We have squirrels. What do we have? So, an elephant. I don't know if they do in Omaha. There's this cool zoo where I grew up, Columbia. It's called the Zoological Park. But none of the animals are caged. Isn't that cool? But they are taken and kept in their places by natural barriers. Do you know what will stop an elephant? A 4-foot ditch. It's really cool. You go there, and the only thing between you and Dumbo is a 4-foot ditch. Dumbo's an elephant, by the way. Oh, you're handing me a microphone. Thank you. But, so, here, you do this while I. Good. There you go. It's on. All right.
Play stop. Hey! Ooh. So please give generously. We need new microphones. Okay. So, the mighty elephant can be stopped by a 4-foot ditch because he will not cross anything that he cannot touch the bottom with his trunk. Do you know what an impala is? Not the car. An impala, it's an African animal. And it's like a gazelle, and it can jump amazing distances. Amazing distances. But the same thing. You can put up a little 4-foot fence, and it won't cross it. Because an impala will not jump somewhere where it can't see where its feet are going to land. Oh, I'm glad we're not like the impalas. Don't let fear fence you in from what God calls you to do, or where God calls you to go. You may not be able to see where your feet are going to land. You may not even be able to see the bottom. But if God has asked you to do something, He's already made a way for you to do it. And incidentally, the devil wants to make you afraid. And he will fill us full of fear, even if it's just a little 4-foot ditch or a tiny little fence. Let me tell you something about fear. Fear is the enemy of everything. Fear is the enemy of every relationship between you and other people, between you and God. Fear will keep us from doing things and saying things that we need to do and say. But fear is the killer of relationships.
You got fear,
Don't.
you got nothing. You got fear, you got nothing.
You got fear, you got nothing. Absolutely. Don't let fear fence you in. All right, next thing. So, Abram traveled through the land as far as the side of the great tree of Morah and Shechem. And at that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said to your offspring, I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. Also, the Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are to the north, the south, the east, and the west. All the land that you see, I will give you, and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Oh, you guys are doing very good. Applause for our technicians who are just... can see the sweat coming down. Is he going? Is he going? Okay. Now these are like 3 different instances. So remember, he said, get up and go, I'll show you the land later. Just get up and go. And he goes. Anywhere along the way, God appears to him, and he keeps reiterating what he said. He keeps saying the promise again. I'm going to give this land to you and your kids. I'm going to give this land to you and your kids. Your offspring are going to be incountable and innumerable. And every time he did, Abraham built an altar. Why is that significant? He built an altar every time God showed up. In fact, if you read his life, anytime he and God had a moment, he builds an altar to remember. When has God showed up in your life? We got to build altars of remembrance when God has worked in our lives. The greatest fear we have of forfeiting our future is forgetting how God has led us in the past. The greatest fear of forfeiting the future is forgetting how God led us in the past. I mean, right now, think back. Where has God showed up in your life? Build that altar of remembrance. God showed up here. God showed up here. And if we had time, which I'm sure I don't, I would tell you how many times God has showed up in my life in big, middle, and little ways. But they're always important because they give me faith that God keeps going. Because God understands we need that. You know what else we need? We need to come here to this building every week to do something. That, by the way, the sermon, the message is the least important part of church, if you haven't figured that out yet. We get up, we talk. It's the least important part of church, is the message. You know what the biggest part of church is when we get together and you go into that room or whatever room we hold it in and you tell me how God showed up in your life this last week. Because your story helps me. My story helps you. We have community. We have togetherness. We have relationship. A sermon is like a one-way deal. I get to talk and you get to take a nap. But when we share, we're going both ways. Build altars of remembrance and then share them with someone, just like Abraham did. Abraham built the altar, he left, you know what happened? People came out, and kids and other people go, what's this pile of rocks here? He says, oh, Abraham built it. You don't know, Abraham built that. He built that because he and his God had a conversation with him. And it was a testimony to the people around, even after he left. Okay, let's keep going. So, your background's not a barrier, don't let fear fence you in, and build those altars of remembrance. Okay, next part of Abraham's life. He gets an F for faith. He gets an F for false. Abraham had some faults. He had a few. Let's look at one. So, one of the first things, the stories that come up with Abraham, you think, what if one of the few things that Abraham did that he really messed up on? We call it the Sister Sarah scare. So, Abraham was married to Sarah. And they were related, by the way. And so what happens, they were traveling around on this journey that God called them to get up and go, and I'll show you land. And when you get there, one of the places they came to settle in was Egypt. They got to Egypt, one, because there was famine, actually. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, because, later on, Joseph and his family, they get to go to Egypt because of the famine. You're going to see a lot of parallels here. So, they get to go, they're in Egypt, and the king of Egypt. Now, there was a famine in the land. Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Oh, come on. That deserves an awe.
Amen.
Thank you. I know what a beautiful woman you are. Thank you. One person. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. And then they will go past my text. And they will say, let's kill him so we can have her. So tell them you're my sister. Was that a lie?
No.
No, not really.
Yeah.
Sort of. They were related. Sort of his half or something. But what's he doing here? It's a lie of omission. He's not telling the whole truth. Wow, I wonder who else did that. And so, here you go. So they said, I'll be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. So he does it. Isn't that just human? He's settled, he's got his family, and he's all good to go for But here he doesn't trust God with this. And so, what happens? Situational ethics for marriage. So I'm in a hurry, so I'll pick on people I don't know. You, sir. What's your name? Nick. I thought you said Nick. I was like, oh, you're foreign. All right, Nick. Welcome to Get With You. Do you have a wife? Yes. Okay, come up here. Just you. I spare her. She gets to throw things from that view.
Are you going to want me to come back to Get With You?
Go, this is it. It's a one-time deal after this. You'll be fearful of coming, that's true. All right, so next I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to look at your wife. I'm sure you say, as Abraham did, how beautiful she is every day.
Yeah.
And I want you to look at her. Don't look at the screen, just look at her. We're going to throw out some questions, and as soon as you hear the question, how long have you been married, by the way? You're not doing well there. It's a bad start. 17 years, so you may actually be able to answer some of these questions. We'll see. All right. So, everybody else, you can look straight. You cannot. Look at your wife.
All right.
Okay. There you go. All right. Question number 1. Situational ethics for marriage. When your wife asks you, does this make me look fat? You say, no. Ever. That is the answer no matter when it's asked. Good. Question number 2 is, do these shoes go with this dress? Yes. Why are you asking us in the first place? We're guys. We have 2 pairs of shoes. Tennis shoes and work shoes, and that's it. Women have how many? A lot.
Although that doesn't necessarily ring true in our household.
That's either. For many women, it's like the sands of the sea. Yes. All right. Number 3. I love your mom. Don't you love mine?
Yes.
Yes.
My mom is a rock star.
Oh, wow. That one's easy. Very good. Okay. She's a rock star.
Yeah, she's awesome.
That's awesome. That's good. I've got a pre-written answer for the next one.
Okay.
In case you've never run into it. And when you're walking out in public and she sees another girl, she points and says, do you think she's pretty? No. Apparently you haven't learned yet. This is a very insidious question that no matter how you answer it will always come back to haunt you in some long forgotten time. So, I want you to read from here down to here. This is the answer you should be giving, by the way.
Alright. Do I, a fellow who has never had an indiscretion in his life and who is entirely loyal to you, his lady love, think that girl is pretty? Well, speaking in purely scholastic terms and while conveying no intent through those words.
Okay, we're out of time. So, you get to sit down. I think you did well. Thank you. So before we're too hard on Abraham, let's talk about situational ethics. Sometimes we don't always tell the truth. And this is what Abraham is doing. And what happened? It got him into trouble. If you know the story, then the Pharaoh thought, well, she's free and single. And so he takes her to be his wife. And you know what happens? God strikes Pharaoh and his house with disease before he can take her. And then the truth comes out. And in most instances, that would have been an act where you would be put to death immediately. But what happened? Pharaoh's dismissal of Abraham was kind and generous. He actually told him to leave. He went to him and said, why have you done this to me? I almost committed this horrible act of sin against you and your God. Why have you done this? Take the people and go. It was kind and generous, but he made him leave Egypt, for he dared not permit him to remain. He had ignorantly been about to do him a serious injury, but God had interposed and saved the monarch from committing so grave a sin. Pharaoh saw in this stranger a man whom the God of heaven honored, and he feared to have in his kingdom one who was so evidently under divine favor. Abraham was totally wrong, and he totally messed up. and God still brought some good things out of it. Pharaoh was deeply impressed, so much so that he didn't kill Abraham. He didn't throw him in prison. He said, "You need to leave because you are obviously very close to the God of heaven, who is a powerful God." It was a witness and a testimony that would come back generations later to another Pharaoh, to another patriarch and his family who were stuck in Egypt. And so even in the midst of failure, God was able to bring out something good. And that's something else that he teaches us, that our failures are never final. Our failures are never final. What does God say? He gives us a promise about this. All things work together for those who love God. It doesn't mean the good things. It doesn't mean just the things you do right. It means every event happening in your life, God can bring good out of it. Even our horrible mistakes. Even our failures. You are not the sum total of your actions. Our failures are never final. Okay, next. What else we got? How we doing? We're doing fine. Okay. All right. So here's something else. So here we got, the promise. The promise. God said, "I'm gonna." At this point, God is visiting. The three guys come in and they say, "You're gonna have a kid. Sarah's gonna have a baby." And there was the laughter. Right? Because I'm 100 years old. Sarah's gonna have a baby. Yeah, sure. And it wasn't happening. And it wasn't happening. And it wasn't happening. And God kept saying, "I'm going to give your descendants." And at that point, he didn't have any descendants. And every time God gave him the promise, your descendants will inherit it. He didn't have any descendants. So what eventually happens? Now, Sarah, Abraham's wife, had born him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children." Isn't it interesting how she goes right and blames God? We blame God for everything. Isn't that weird? Even in today's tragedies, listen to people's initial reaction. How could God let that happen? How could God do that? We're so anxious to blame God for things and so very unanxious to actually hold Satan responsible. That's why we study the great controversy, because we know there's a good and evil. We know there's a right and wrong. We know there's Jesus and there's the devil. But here, the Lord's kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abraham had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah's wife took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. Well, that sounds like a good idea. What could possibly go wrong? Isn't it interesting and so arrogant of us when we think we have to help God out? Because apparently God is busy somewhere else in the world, and whatever it is he's supposed to be doing for us, he just needs a little help from us to get it done. And there we have Abraham and Sarah picking up that very foolish thought. Let's give God a hand. And what happens? He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew he was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And Sarah said to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering." What? This was her idea. Man of 17 years of marriage, does this make sense to you? Go do this. And when it turns out bad, this is your fault. And here she is. You're responsible. I would just love to have been there to see Abraham. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. What did Abraham? All he can say, your slave is in your hands. Just do with her whatever you think best. And Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Ooh. Her plan is backfiring, and she mistreats Hagar. There's another thing we can learn from this whole experience. There is a God, and you're not him. God doesn't need our help. He has a time, he has a plan, And just because it doesn't fit our time schedule, it fits his time schedule, which if we knew what it was, we'd choose it in the first place. Remember, God's timing is very different from our timing. My dad had a great saying he used to tell me, God is rarely early, but he's never late. God doesn't need our help in fulfilling any of his promises. And there's a whole list of things. If you can take life and you go, here's God's job and here's my job. Here's all the things that God's supposed to do, here's all the things I'm supposed to do in my life. And God, we can't do God's job and he won't do our job. So if I took the time and had a chalkboard and said, list these things, you probably have things on both columns, God's job, my job. Do you know what really is on our column, the thing for us? Show up. Period. There is no more. You show up. You put yourself in God's presence. Now there's ways to do that, but that's what we do. Everything else comes from that. Everything else is God's job. It's God's job to tell you where he wants you to go. It's God's job to show you where he wants you to go. It's God's job to lead you the way he wants to lead you. That's why he has angels and the Holy Spirit. And all the resources of heaven that he's promised us is we'll just show up. If we'll put ourselves there, no matter what condition we're in, we put ourselves there and say, Lord, here I am, do whatever. That's the power of choice, and that is the entire focus of the Great Conference. When you choose to be in God's presence, when we choose that, make that choice, God does everything else. Okay, moving right along. The angel of the Lord found Hagar, because Hagar ran away. Remember, she got so mistreated, Hagar ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that was beside the road to shore. And he said to Hagar, son of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? I am running away from Mr. Sarah, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that you will become too numerous to count. Sounds like a great thing, sounds like a great blessing, and it was a blessing. It's the way God was taking care of her. But this, again, is where we go back to the descendants of Abraham, of Isaac and Ishmael. And this is where, because of this, God, Abraham and Sarah trying to do his work, came up with their choices impacting the entire world. Can you imagine that scene when Hagar shows back up at the king? I'm back. and you know, all Sarah's like, why are you back here? It's God. That had to be a big lesson for Sarah. God sent her back. Which, in that moment, Hagar had an experience with God. And I only include this because I think it's the most beautiful thing, one of the most beautiful things in the Bible. She says, she gave the name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Take that in for a second. Isn't that awesome? You are the God who really sees me. Where was Hagar? What had happened to her? Was it her fault? She was a slave. She was doing what she was told. She was being persecuted for doing what she was told to do. She was being persecuted for no fault of her own. She was kicked out. She was abandoned. She was lost. She was alone. And she was pregnant. Or she had a kid. Lost, abandoned, alone. And she says, you're the God who sees me. And ever been there. If you haven't, one day you might be. And if you have that experience where you feel mistreated, kicked out, abandoned, and lost and alone, remember there's a God who sees you, who never forsakes or abandons us. As he did with Hagar, he shows up and tells us, here's the next step. Go back. Okay, moving right on. So, he has faith, he's a man of faults. The third F is, he's a man of family. Wow, I got hurt. Alright, so, let's go. Abraham is a man of family. Now Lot, who was along with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together. Remember, Lot with them, and they were originally, and they went out, and God blessed them both. They had lots of camels and sheep and goats and lions, tigers, and bears and lions. They had all kinds of things. But the possessions were so great they were not able to stay together. Quarreling arose between Abram's herds and Lot's herds. So we have a family situation here where families are living together and not getting along. I mean, that doesn't happen today, but back in the Old Testament, people had a hard time living together as families. And so Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herds and mine, for we are close relatives. It's not the whole land before you. Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Abraham's antidote for family feuds. This is another thing amazing about Abraham. He was a man of faith, he was a man of faults, he was a man of family. And here's his idea. Number one, you take the initiative to find solutions. He didn't wait till things boiled over, didn't wait till things got out of control. He gets Lot, he pulls him aside and says, let's make a solution. Let's make a solution. Take the initiative to find solutions. Number two, let others have first choice, even if it means not getting what you want. That's hard. But when we take that, that's also called humility. Let somebody else have the first choice. Okay, and put family peace above personal desires. Put the peace above what you want, or what you even think might be right. And this is what Abraham did. Lot was wrong in every way. We're going to see that in a second. But Abraham didn't care. Abraham was the elder. Abraham was the statesman. Abraham had all the right in the world to tell Lot exactly what to do. In more ways than one. And yet he said, you choose. And I'll take whatever's left. He put peace before what he wanted. So Lot looked around, saw the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar, was well watered like the garden, Lord like the land of Egypt. This is before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, because obviously after that it would be worth having. And so Lot chose for himself the whole plain of Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abraham lived in Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Not a good. Okay. Get a lot to learn. A man to be out. Lot had a lot to learn. Number one, he was selfish and somewhat ungrateful. Lot prospered only because he was with Abraham. Lot's prosperity was due mostly to his connection with Abraham. And yet he didn't show his gratitude for that when Abraham and Lot went up and he said, choose. Number two, he put material wealth above spiritual health. So he had a lot of stuff, and he looks out on the land, and he knows good and well what Sodom and Gomorrah are like. He knows good and well what those cities are like. Yet, that was to him appeared the better of the two lands for his flocks and for his material possessions. And so he put his family in spiritual, dangerous waters, which we're going to see how that played out, worked for him. He put his material wealth above the spiritual health of himself and his family. Number three, he was easily seduced by pride and position. You may not know that, but in Sodom, Lot was probably, I can't remember 100%, but most likely Lot was some sort of town elder, leader, something. If they had the equivalent of the state capital, he probably had a position there, because he was a man of great wealth, and people with great wealth were the ones who were elected to positions, who did things in the community as leaders. And so he saw that as something to be gained. He negotiates around what is doing right. How did he do that? Remember, in the story, so the angels come down, they visit, because Abraham had pleaded with God, they're down there, and they're telling him, here are angels of heaven telling you, God's destroying the city, it's all wiped out, and they're in there telling you, know they're the angels of God himself. And you know, sorry, the guys come to the door because they've seen the guys, and this is a religious praise society, they're banging on the door, give us those men who just entered your house. And what does Lot do? He negotiates. He doesn't do what's right. He doesn't go out and tell them, these are angels of heaven, and you back off or things are going to get ugly. He negotiates, take my daughters instead. I don't care what value they placed on women in that society, that's just wrong. And he knew it was wrong. And yet he offered up his own family, so he was trying to negotiate to give them just enough to appease them. He negotiates around doing what is right. Also, he hesitates at God's command. So they said, the angel of God is for the story, the city is destroyed, get out, get out, get out. When Lot hesitates, the Bible says Lot hesitated so much so that the angels had to grab him, his wife and daughter, and drag him out of the city. Can you imagine an angel coming to you and saying, well, this whole block here has been, being sacrificed by God, so he's going to destroy the city block here. You're going to be saved in 5 minutes, so let's go. And would you just sit around and have a conversation about what time I just paid off my mortgage? An angel of the Lord is telling you, yeah, because here comes the fire and the brimstone, and he hesitates. He hesitates in a direct command from God. We try to hear the Lord speak to me in my prayers. Here's an angel verbally telling him, and he hesitates. And yet, out of all those things, what one term would you come up for Lot to describe him? And the term the Bible comes up with is righteous. And if he rescued Lot, a righteous man, was distressed by the depraved and conduct of loss, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. There was still something good in Lot, that the Bible still calls him a righteous man. In the end, he makes the right choice. In the end, even with a lot of pulling by God, he makes the right choice. I tell you that because we don't always cross the finish line with God in something he gives us to do in the best ways. Sometimes, instead of following the leading of the Holy Spirit, God has grabbed us and yanked us along. And sometimes he has to do that, and that's okay. He had to do it with Lot. It's okay that we don't do things perfectly. So remember, your background's not a barrier. Don't let fear fence you in. Build altars of remembrance. Your failures are not final. There is a God and you're not him. And faithfulness sets the foundation for future fortitude. You're the only one that remembers. That was Bert's big line last night. Faithfulness sets the future foundation for future fortitude. Go ahead. Hold that thought. Remember, Lot chose to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham went the other way. Abraham's descendants became the children of Israel and inherited the land. What happened to Lot's descendants? What happened to Lot's family? Remember, he chose to put his family, his spiritual well-being, and underneath his desire for material wealth. Do you know the rest of the story? They got out of the city, and what happened? His 2 daughters committed incest with Lot. Because they said, well, there's not going to be any guys for us. Without them knowing it, each one of them went in and they had a baby by their own father. And what happened to those descendants? They became the Jebusites and the Amorites. Does that sound familiar to you? Because those are the 2 of the big people, part of this group of the Philistines, that Abraham's descendants had to fight and battle out of the promised land. Lot's choice led his descendants to being against God and being forced out of the promised land. Abraham's humility allowed his descendants to inherit the promised land. The faithful choices we make today are setting the foundation for our future. Every choice we make today has an impact on who we'll be tomorrow. Okay, now, this is the last thing I gotta do, and it's my grand job. This is the most powerful point. And so for something like that, I need great patriarchs. So you and me, because you're on the front row. Yeah, that'd be These are your lines. These are your lines. Now you notice it. So nobody It's fun. So, you'll see on the top there's little things it says to do. So you kind of like mind doing it because I didn't bring all the props with me. So you just have to mind doing it. And I'll explain, as you're doing this, I'll explain to the audience what's going on. Okay? So you can just stand here a second. So, here's one of the most coolest things about the story of Abraham. You may not know this. So again, God shows up on his journey. God always shows up on our journey. Wherever he calls us, he always gives us moments where he reaffirms his work in us. He shows up on our journey. He shows up on Abraham's journey. And here, in one of Abraham's most depressing, darkest moments, he has cried out to God and says, how can I know? And this is what happens. I'll do it. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer and a goat, ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these things to him, cut them in two, arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds out and not cut in half. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. All day long, Abraham watches the sacrifice he's made, and he will not let anything touch the fire. Next. But I would want to. No, that's wrong. Okay, as the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. What's he talking about? Egypt. He's talking about the children of Israel and Egypt. But I will punish the nations they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried in good old age. And the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here for the descendant of the Amorites, descendants of Lot, by the way. Thank you. Has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set, darkness had fallen, a smoking fire top with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants, I give this land. Now he explained that. So he cries out, he says, how can I know? How can I know? God says, do this. And so come up here on stage. And it says, bringing the ram, the goat, the heifer, the pigeons, everything. He cuts them in half. And by the way, this is what it's called cutting a covenant. This is what the process involved. And it was an irrevocable, unbreakable promise you were making. And so they would take the animals and they would split them precisely right down the middle of the spine. And they would lay out half and half, half and half, right? Okay. And then, this is what would happen. Right there. Okay. The two people who were making the covenant would do this. They would do certain things and say certain things, and we're going to demonstrate that for you now. So you're about to cut it out. So you have to imagine the sacrifices on either side of these two men. Okay? And he takes off his robe, he gives it to the other guy. This guy takes off his robe, so they exchange robes. And they say together now,
I am putting on you and you me. We are now one.
I am putting on you and you me, we are now one. Okay? Then the next thing they did,
Your enemies are now mine, and mine are yours.
so they would take their sword, their shield, and they would swap. They would give each other their swords and shields and say, your enemies are mine, mine are now yours. And then next,
When you are weak, my strength will be there for you.
they've taken off their belt and they hand each other their belt. When you're weak, my strength will be there for you. Next.
I die to my independent living and to my rights.
Now, and they would walk in a figure eight, and they would say this, beginning in, I died to my rights, I died myself, I died to my right to have what I want. Okay? Then,
You are eating me and I you.
so they would sit down and they'd have a meal, very like a Passover meal, not exactly, but very much like, and they would say, as they ate together, you are eating me, I am eating you. You see the symbolism? Keep going.
It is agreed, we, once two, have now become one.
And do what it says. So they cut their wrists. Oh my word. Have you never seen Ben Hur? Okay. Ah, come on. thought they were going to do this number. And so, okay, next. They raise a fist to heaven and they say,
God, do so to me,
and then they point to the animals.
if I break this covenant.
Do so to me, as these animals have been done. Do to me if I break this covenant. Finally, they get dirt, they rub it into their cut, and they say,
Wherever I am, when I lift my
and
hand and see the scar, I will remember I have a covenant partner.
listen, whenever I see the scar, I will remember I have a covenant partner. Okay?
Because of the covenant, I have a new identity.
They actually exchange new names.
Now I call you friend Red, my friend who sticks closer than a brother.
Okay, and they build an altar, and they say, I now have a friend that sticks closer than a brother, and they part ways, and that's the end of the covenant. Okay, thank you very much. There was applause. So, did you get all that symbolism? I now have a friend that sticks closer than a brother. You are now eating me, I you. Whenever I see the scar, I know, and the scar was in the wrist, I have a covenant partner. Do you see the symbolism? This was a man-made thing. And the serious depth of it was, do to me, Lord, if I ever break this promise, do to me what you've done to these animals. And go back to the text, and it says, a smoking pot full of fire sort of passed through that the sacrifice consumed it. What's the smoking pot and the fire represent in the Bible? It was in the temple. It's the presence of God. God himself came down and made this covenant with Abraham. Later on, not today, I know you're saying not today, but later on, he said, that's the covenant that makes you human being. He comes to our level and says, I'm going to make you a promise because I'm going to meet you where you're at, and I'm going to do this so that you know I'm serious. I'm going to make these scars of myself. I'm going to cut this covenant in blood so that I'll never forget you because I will be your friend as close as a brother. I will always remember you for my scars. I will give you a new name, a new identity, new clothes. Because the God of heaven has cut a covenant with you and me.